Paul Wallis is an internationally best-selling author, researcher, and scholar of ancient mythologies. Paul's work has probed the world's mythologies and ancestral narratives for their insight on our origins as a species and our potential as human beings. As a senior churchman, Paul served as a church doctor, a theological educator, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. He has published numerous titles on Christian mysticism and spirituality, the popular speaker at summits and conferences around the world. Paul's work in church ministry has included training pastors in the interpretation of biblical texts. His work in biblical translation and interpretation has revealed a forgotten layer of ancient history, one with enormous implications for our understanding of the human race and our place in the universe.
I have with me from the Fifth Kind TV, his books, Echoes of Eden, Scars of Eden, and Escaping from Eden. I have with me Paul Anthony Wallis, endorsed by Eric von Daniken. His new book, Echoes of Eden, endorsed by George Norrie, has just been released. So I want to give him a big warm welcome back to my show. I love talking about these subjects with you. We always get into great discussions. I wanted to ask you, I read Escaping from Eden and Scars of Eden. Where did you want to go with Echoes of Eden?
At the end of Escaping from Eden, I had got to a place where I was actually very excited about the implications for us today regarding human potential. What are we capable of if these are the real stories of our origins, stories rooted in paleo-contact? And I had noticed that when you listen with an open ear to the world's ancestral narratives from indigenous traditions, the themes of ancient ET contact and human potential are absolutely interwoven. And those traditions talk about higher cognitive powers, the possibility that we can live more intelligently, more consciously on this planet and have a better human experience. And so that's where Escaping ends. And I knew I had to go back and explore that further. The Scars of Eden looks at what is the impact, what is the aftermath. How has society been altered by contact in the deep past? And does that help us to understand the present day any differently? And again, at the end of the Scars of Eden, I recognized that the wisdom with which to answer those questions resides with our world of ancestral narratives. So in Echoes, I go back and sit at the feet of the guardians of indigenous cultures all around the world, and I find a coherent picture regarding human potential, human origins, our human future. And I find that there is a coherent body of information that has been suppressed in every age and yet somehow manages to resurface and be rediscovered by every generation.
It seems like people are more interested in this subject, that they want to discover their real heritage and their real roots. As you say, there's stories all over the world. So I think it's prevalent, but do you think people are really getting into this now?
I'm contacted every week, every day, by people telling me, I no longer believe what I did 10 years ago. I've got a tremendous appetite on me to find out what's really going on, what's the truth of the human story, what are we really capable of. And what strikes me is that it's people in every age bracket who are saying this to me. People really do want to know what's the truth of who we are, what we're capable of. Can we have a better experience than this on planet Earth? So yes, I think there's something special happening right now that we've not seen before.
When you talk about our human potential, if you look at the old Sumerian myth of Adapa, I think it's interesting in there because they talk about how the Anunnaki made Adapa the wisest of the Anunnaki, and he was human. So it makes me wonder, did they make us better than them, or did they give us qualities that we can even be better than our ET predecessors?
The conflict over that issue that's there in Genesis 3, translated conventionally, it's the story of the fall, where Adam and Eve eat the apple, they get forbidden knowledge, so on and so forth. And in the current translation, it's God who wants to keep the humans so primitive they don't even know they're naked. He wants to keep them at an animal level. And it's the serpent who wants to upgrade them for a better human experience. Well, you read that translation, you know something's off. God can't be the one against human progress, can he? Do the translation work I argue for in Escaping from Eden, you realize that that story is just one iteration of many that talks about a conflict over how intelligent the human beings should be in the context of a long program of genetic modification. You can go to Nigeria and listen to the epic story of origins and the powerful beings there, the sky people, Bassi and Atai, also say we don't want them as clever as us. They've got so clever, we're now struggling to manage them. Go to the Mesoamerican story of the Mayan tradition and the Popol Vuh, and the chief genetic engineer, Cucumatz, aka Kukulkan, aka Quetzalcoatl, is conducting a sequence of experiments to try and get a Homo sapiens that's clever enough to be useful to them as a working class, but not so intelligent that they won't want to work for them. As in many stories, Quetzalcoatl overshoots the mark and he creates a Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens that's even cleverer than we are, a little bit more remote viewing than we have, a little more precognition than we have, better telepathic connection, better self-healing. Sure enough, they have an emergency meeting to say, how can we dial these down so that they'll be just smart enough to work for us? And that conversation, how can we dial them down because we've made them too clever? Well, that's in Genesis 11, the Babel story. It's in the Zeus and Prometheus story from out of ancient Greece. It's in the Abassi and Atai story from out of Nigeria. It's almost a universal aspect of the story of origins according to world mythology. The beings that were generated surprised the ancient genetic engineers. And I have a theory that they were surprised because they underestimated the intelligence that we brought with us from our animal and mammal heritage. My dog is probably a better remote viewer than I am. Birds certainly have a better sense of direction. My cat can see things I can't see. I just wonder if they underestimated how much we were bringing to the party as earthlings, and they ended up with a species too smart. And so Zeus punishes Prometheus for making the human beings a technological species. Abassi and Atai release devices into the environment to make the humans mentally ill and physically ill, to make them more manageable. In the Mayan story, a vapor is sprayed over human populations to brain damage them so that we'll no longer have remote viewing, precognition, telepathic connection. This is how the theme repeats all around the world.
It's really interesting. It makes me wonder what our real potential is, because as I've been doing this research, practicing remote viewing and practicing psi abilities, I've been able to open up my own psychic ability. Have you had the same experience?
That's very much a theme within Echoes of Eden. We can talk about having higher cognitive abilities, but can we engage them? And Echoes of Eden says, yes, we absolutely can. To take us further, we really need to sit at the feet of elders and guardians of indigenous traditions who've maintained protocols through generations of enhancing consciousness. You mentioned remote viewing. The US had a remote viewing program running through the CIA, now subcontracted out. The roots of the British intelligence service, MI5 and MI6, were a department of remote viewing, which John Dee had set up, tasked to do that by Queen Elizabeth I. She believed it was possible because of what was in the literature of the day, some of which had come from the Mayan tradition. I love how the Mayan story hints at the possibility of remote viewing. It says that the Homo sapiens sapiens had vision that wasn't limited in the way ours is. Well, how is our vision limited? It's limited by surfaces. You can't see into things, through things, or behind things. Limited by distance. You can't see beyond the horizon. You can't see into deep space. Limited by time. You can only see the present. You can't see the past. You can't see the future. Limited by frequency. We can only see this spectrum of radio waves. Maybe a cat can see this, a dog can see this. Take all those limits off. Now you can see into deep space. You can remote view the rings of Jupiter, as Ingo Swann did in 1973, before any scientist has even posited that they existed. You can do future viewing. You can have X-ray vision with all the implications for self-healing. Those implications were understood by the West back in the 1500s. In the meantime, indigenous traditions around the world had been practicing initiation ceremony to switch these faculties on for each new generation of young people as they came up to initiation age. And this gives a little bit of a clue as to why, through the ages, colonizing powers have always sought to extinguish indigenous wisdom, slaughter indigenous priests, burn indigenous literature, and in the US, for instance, for 100 years, illegalize indigenous initiation ceremony because they didn't want information and abilities passed on from one generation to the next. And so I talk about this in Echoes of Eden, this pattern that you can find in every age where there's an attempted sequestering of human technologies for government and a rubbishing of it for everybody else, so that if there's any possibility of remote viewing, it's only known by our intelligence services, not by you and me.
I was thinking about this, the story of Berossus writing Oannes and the Apkallu. You touch on that in Echoes of Eden. I thought that was kind of important to talk about as well.
One of the stories that has been forbidden by every colonizing power has been the story of paleo contact. When I was in Brazil, for instance, in the 1980s, I attended some harvest festivals. And I thought I knew what was going on. I thought we were thanking God for another harvest. But I had a guide who said, you might want to look and listen a little bit more closely. None of the ceremonies that happen before we go into the church building are Catholic ceremonies. So you might want to ask where they've come from and what they're really celebrating. My guide was absolutely right. Glued on to the Catholic Mass of Thanksgiving for the harvest was the celebration of contact with an entity referred to as the Queen of Heaven. Now, I thought that meant Jesus' mum, because that's one of the titles the Catholic Church gives to Mary. And I found out, no, the Queen of Heaven came from the stars thousands of years ago to teach our ancestors all the secrets of agriculture, how to turn naturally occurring plants into cultivatable crops, how to turn those crops into food, how to live off those crops in a way that doesn't deplete them. That's what we're celebrating. And so we've got corn figurines representing this female entity that taught us these things, and then foods and drinks all derived from corn, the great leap forward. This is a story of paleo contact. Now, looking back, I understand why Pope John Paul II was trying to clean up all those ceremonies so that all that remained was the Mass in the church and the indigenous knowledge that had come from the interior of Brazil and the indigenous knowledge that had come from West Africa when Africans were stolen and used as slaves in the plantations in Brazil. All those stories which carried the memory of paleo contact, Pope John Paul was trying to wipe them out. And it was an absolute parallel. If I had gone to a town near Jerusalem in the 7th century BCE, I would have had an identical experience, harvest festivals, where we are remembering paleo contact, entities that came and gave us the secrets of agronomy, that achieved for us this great leap forward from living in animal subsistence to being civilization builders. Again, there were people from HQ in Jerusalem trying to stamp out these ceremonies, stamp out the name of Asherah, get rid of the figurines of Asherah. That was the name they gave to the female entity that gave these primordial lessons. And you can find that all around the world, this memory of first contact. And Berossus describes it beautifully. He's writing a Babylonian document. So first contact refers to first contact in the Fertile Crescent. We're talking about the ancestors of the Sumerians, really. And he talks about these entities coming from somewhere who are not human and who taught our ancestors all the accoutrements of life as a civilization. What I love about his description is that Berossus tells us what the people were thinking as they saw these strange visitors. And they weren't impressed by their technology or their advanced wisdom. What they were perplexed by is, why do they look so strange? Are they human or not? They're wearing clothes that cover the whole of their body. This was completely strange to them, that you'd have clothing covering the whole of your body. And what is that textile? It's so thin and silvery. It's like the skin of a fish. And it's almost like you're hearing the thoughts as they finger the clothing and wonder why their visitors look so strange. Well, that's exactly how you would expect our ancient ancestors to respond to people arriving from elsewhere in the cosmos, as I would argue, and teaching them all the accoutrements of civilization. It's a lovely visual moment, and it's one of many that when you listen, especially to the correlations of stories around the world, you realize it is visual memory that's being described to you. It's not a book that's gone around the world and been retranslated. It's not a story that's gone as oral tradition in Chinese whispers. Different cultures have different language, different metaphor, different names to describe the same thing their ancestors saw. And it was those correlations of visual memory and sometimes auditory memory that have made me listen to world mythology and ancestral narrative differently, that make me approach it with the question, what did they see? What is the memory that this story has been written to carry?
A couple of things you pointed out that were really interesting is it wasn't just Berossus. You had said Plato was getting some information from ET contact, as well as the Hermetic text and the Cathars. Is that correct?
All of those sources that you mentioned talk about contact as one of their sources of understanding. Plato has a number of sources of information, and one is what he called philosophy. I think really we would call it science, because it's the application of logic to things we can all observe. Much of his writing is structured that way, and it's absolutely inspiring, the far-reaching conclusions he arrives at through that simple method. He also talks about information that's come to him from ancestral narratives, from the remnant of the ancient Egyptian priesthood. And they said their information came from the remnant of the Atlantean civilization, subject all its own. But then Plato was also very open that some of his information came from interdimensional contact with other entities. Plato actually credits this experience to Socrates, but I argue in Echoes of Eden that this is an experience Plato had had. He's referring to a psychedelic experience he had in Athens through ingesting a special brew that had been curated by the Eleusinian sect. Here's this pattern of initiation again. Initiates of that sect were given this tea to induce near-death experience, carefully curated so people wouldn't actually die, but taking people close enough that they begin to have experiences of contact with other kinds of entity, and then they come back informed by that contact. So that's the claim Plato/Socrates makes. It's also the same claim that's made by the writers of the Corpus Hermeticum. Some people might say, oh, that's just a literary gloss. This is just framing the information that the book gives. But when you realize there's this context of literature around the world, of writers willing to say some of this information came from a contact experience, you start raising an eyebrow. It's there in the Bible too, by the way. It sounds really far out, I think, to a person of faith in today's world. But when you go to the roots of Christianity, in 1 John 4, the writer fully expects the early Christians to be having contact experiences with beings he calls spirits. Does he mean ancestral spirits? Does he mean interdimensional contact? Does he mean physical beings who communicate telepathically? By spirit, does he mean a non-material being, or does he mean a material being? Because in some cultures, a spirit is a material being. In PNG, the word moon spirit refers to a three-dimensional creature that looks like a gecko. and that travels in some kind of vessel that can get it from here to the moon. So that's not a disembodied, immaterial thing. That's a solid thing that exists in the heritage of PNG. So these are just a few examples that talk very openly in the past about contact, and yet through the ages, this kind of conversation and information has been pushed out of the mainstream. It's there in the Bible, but it's not in the core curriculum of Christianity. If you go to traditional healers around the world, you'll get the same worldview with regard to ongoing contact to support us in our progress through life. But if you go to Zambia, you'll have to go to one of the villages to hear this, to one of the traditional healers. You won't hear it in school. You won't hear it on the TV. And that's the pattern I talk about in Echoes of Eden. One layer of information carried at the folkloric level, and the other carried by government, education, school, etc. It's at the folkloric level that we discover all the stories of paleo-contact and the protocols for releasing higher human cognitive power.
Do you think we're being prepared for contact now on a mainstream level? Like, I realize there's all this contact going on, and you touch on that. Like, if we want to talk about a modern day case, you touch on the Zimbabwe encounter, which I think is one of the best modern day examples of contact, where all those school kids saw that craft and they had some kind of telepathic messages from beings. Did you think that was a knockout as far as like a modern contact case? But then also, do you think we're being prepared for contact on a mainstream level?
Yes, I do think we're being prepared. I think that what we're seeing now with Senate briefings, congressional hearings, NASA talking about investigating contact, this is something we've not seen for 70 years. For 70 years, the story has been, there's no such thing as ETs, how ridiculous, and there's no such thing as UFOs and close encounters. Everything started accelerating in 2017 when Chris Mellon, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, leaked the Pentagon's footage of the USS Nimitz encounter with a Tic Tac craft. So that was suddenly viewable by the general public, and it was on the TV for us all to see. 2 years later, 2019, the Pentagon comes forward and authenticates that and says, yes, we've had a unit in place for 70 years investigating these encounters, and yes, indeed, Luis Elizondo did head it up for 10 years, investigating physical materials retrieved from UFO crashes. Then we heard from Alain Juillet, the former chief of French security, saying, yes, that's all correct, and I was there when the current iteration of that unit was set up for that investigation. We've heard from physicists who briefed these bodies. So we've heard from Jacques Vallée, we've heard from Eric W. Davis talking about materials retrieved from off-world vehicles not made on this earth. Then we heard from Haim Eshed, the brigadier general who for 27 years was the chief of space security for Israel, joining the dots for us, in case we hadn't done that already, saying that at a covert government level, we've been in contact with spacefaring civilizations for a long, long time, but they've chosen not to self-disclose until we all have a fuller understanding of what space is, which is a curious turn of phrase. These kinds of disclosures from figures this authoritative is new. There was a little precursor to it a decade ago when Dmitry Medvedev, then the Prime Minister of Russia, said on camera, every new Prime Minister of Russia is given a dossier detailing the spacefaring civilizations we're already in contact with. You can probably find that footage still on YouTube and watch for yourself. Ask yourself, do you think he's joking? Doesn't look like he's joking, and he wasn't debunked by the president. So there's been this acceleration of information. Yes, I think it is preparing us for disclosure, but not too aggressively, almost an insurance against disclosure, so that if suddenly something happens that makes it blindingly obvious we're in contact, the authorities can say, oh, don't you remember, we've already talked about this. As for the Rua encounter at Ariel School, Watch James Fox's movie, The Phenomenon, where he has interview footage with the children who experienced this mass sighting in the 1990s. Listen to the interviews between John Mack, then the head of clinical psychology for Harvard, as he interviews the children days after the encounter. Ask yourself, are these children telling the truth? It was a mass sighting, very, very significant for that reason. There have been other really interesting mass sightings. And in the Scars of Eden, I talk about one in Australia, the 1966 Westall incident. That's interesting because it was not only a school full of children who interacted with craft adjacent to the school, but there were official authorities present within minutes as well. The police, the Air Force, the Army. The press was there shortly after to interview people about what had happened. What's interesting about that account is how that experience, though it was a mass sighting, was suppressed. Why was it suppressed? What does that tell us about the politics of contact? I think those two stories side by side are powerful, but I happen to think that there's contact experiences happening all the time. And I hope that my books will encourage people to share their own experiences with friends and family. I do think we're moving into a time when we're better able to listen without ridicule to each other's experiences. And I think if we do that, we will put together a picture pretty quickly that indicates that we are not alone on this planet or in this corner of the cosmos, and really we've never been.
You visited Barbara Lamb in your book. Did you have an experience yourself? Did you talk about that?
I sort of teased the reader with that in the Scars of Eden, because at the end of Scars of Eden, I'm about to go in for a regression session to see if I can surface some more memory of some strange things that happened to me back when I was 20. And that's exactly where Echoes of Eden starts. What was it that happened? How does it relate to a world full of experiences? And what's the so what of that? What difference does that make? For me, it has to do with where it's taken me to listen to stories that are often suppressed with violence, at times with genocide. Some historians estimate that 1 million French people were genocided by 19 successive popes and their armies in order to rid the world of the information that they carried, information that was rooted in contact, that was empowering in terms of actualizing higher cognitive powers and having a better human experience on planet Earth. The Cathars were noted by their neighbors because they had built a better society. In the Languedoc, in the 1200s, this is the period where it all comes to the crunch point. It was their neighbors who called them the Cathars, which means the good people, the pure ones, because they noticed that in the Languedoc you did not have the high rates of crime, poverty, and murder that were endemic in medieval Europe. People wanted to know how they'd done this, and how the Cathars had done it links with what we were talking about before, which was going back to ancestral narratives, to forbidden stories, to Gnostic forms of Christianity, and learning how to activate the higher self. The idea that we have higher dimensions of ourselves that we can access, higher levels of information and understanding, that's what the Cathars were all about, and they had turned it into a living lifestyle and a working society. And it was so threatening to the feudalism of the day, to the power of kings and queens and popes, that it was responded to as if it were a military threat. And 100 years of genocide was perpetrated until every last one of the Cathars had been killed. That's a smoking gun, that there was powerful information there that you and I might do well to take an interest in.
You spoke about getting to our higher self and turning on these powers. One interesting story that I heard you tell, I thought this was so amazing, about this boy in Brazil that gets struck by lightning and his house blows up. And I'll let you take it from there.
When I wrote the story of Taran, that's the name I gave him in Echoes of Eden, I had never heard anything like it. Now, since publishing Echoes of Eden, I have heard more stories of almost identical experiences. What happened to Taran when he was 5 years old, he was struck by lightning. His house was struck by lightning. His house exploded, but he somehow survived, temporarily blinded, but he recovered his sight. Otherwise, he was perfectly well, much to the astonishment of his family. Except that from that time to this, his life has been changed by it. Since that time, he has had recurring experiences of precognition. So he will see things happening long before they happen, and then they happen exactly as he saw. So this is one of those higher cognitive powers we talked about before. Then, every so often, a little less frequently, he has the experience of being pulled out of his body up into what feels like up into the stars, up into space. And there he receives a rapid download of information and understanding and then gets whooshed back into his body. And when he comes to in his body, he has information and understanding that he did not have before. Things like knowledge of advanced mathematics, advanced physics, quantum phenomena, things he did not learn in school. All of a sudden, it's there. As he's gone through life, he says it's almost as if there's a higher, immaterial, more intelligent, more conscious version of himself in a bubble up there somewhere, connected with his material self here on planet Earth, continually feeding him with information, nudges, helping him make progress through life. You might say, well, that sounds awesome. Can I have that experience without being struck by lightning? And the Cathars said, yes, you absolutely can. And here are the protocols. They fully believe that every single one of us can have this experience of tapping higher information to support our progress through life.
I was wondering, what do you think of the Gnostic perspective? They believe in a demiurge, and they kind of believe in almost like a simulation type theory. What are your thoughts on it?
The Gnostic texts represent quite a kaleidoscope of texts, and they're a reminder that in the beginning, Christianity itself was a kaleidoscope of ideas and theologies and experiences and practices. And then as institutional Christianity grew up and was anchored to the Roman Empire, became the Imperial Department of Religion, some of these more interesting ideas and texts were just pushed out of the core curriculum, and with such force that the Gnostic texts, many of them, were literally buried in the desert for their protection, so they'd not be burned, so they'd not be lost to history. And then in the 20th century, we've discovered a great many of them and can go back and reread them and find out what was there in the mix in the beginning. Their worldview really is unpacked by Plato. Plato believed that this material universe is an emanation of or from something else, and that consciousness precedes material. And he gets to that conclusion through his logic applied to things we all observe. So he comes to this mind-boggling idea that when you go back to the beginning, let's talk about that for a moment. Einstein, theory of relativity, proved mathematically, let's put it that strongly, that time has a beginning, that space, material, energy, and time all began in the same moment. So that means that we always have this question, what was before? What was before the universe looked like this? What was before the Big Bang? And Einstein says that you go far enough back and you'll reach a point where time begins. And when you reach that point, before doesn't mean before anymore. And Plato reaches that point, and he says, when you get to the point where before no longer means before, you're looking at a unified field of intelligence and consciousness, and it fractalized into the material universe. The stars, the planets, you and I are all here as part of that consciousness experiencing itself. When you put nuts and bolts on that and ask what that looks like, you get to the theory of panspermia. And that's a theory held to by many serious scientists, particularly in the area of DNA research. So Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix of DNA, taught this. It's the idea that the genetic coding for biological, conscious, intelligent life is part of the cosmos in the same way that gravity, time, and light are. That they are part of the properties of the universe, and that whenever this genetic coding lands in an hospitable environment, meaning a planet with water on it, it will generate forms of life similar to the ones we're familiar with on planet Earth. Plato also talks about other forms of life who are transdimensional, so powerful compared to us. They can download physical forms from the coding that produces stars and planets and human beings. And so it's in that territory we begin to get into this idea of the demiurge, the craftsman. It's in that territory that we hear Plato's language for virtual universe or simulated universe. That's what the craftsman is, someone who can download from the codes to create the physical thing. Plato, when he talks about these things, is distilling something that was part of the international worldview at that time. And that's why we are hearing these same thoughts in the Gnostic texts. Some of the writers of the Gnostic texts may have derived thought directly from Plato. Others were hearing it because this was just the thought world of that time. And it was an acknowledgement of all these layers of being, a populated universe, cosmic cousins on other planets, transdimensional entities who were so more powerful and different to us that it's almost unimaginable, but then protocols for getting in contact with them and tapping their information. All that is in the mix of Plato and the Gnostic texts. And it was all deemed not very useful to the feudalized vision of Christianity that the Roman Empire had, who really wanted something much simpler. One God at the top of the pyramid, just alongside the emperor. Then in the middle, the senators and the bishops. And then at the bottom, the priests and the people meekly paying, praying, and obeying. They wanted to run the empire in the same way any government wants to run its territory, with full spectrum dominance over their populations, where they say what the official sources of information are. They don't want an empowered population that says, well, you've just given us this information, but our interdimensional informers have told us this. They don't want independent news agencies, and certainly not at that level. And I think for that reason, religion has often been pared down to something much simpler, much more empowering to the elites and disempowering to the plebs. And Gnosticism represents a different world, a world where you and I can have cosmic contact, can download cosmic information that's empowering to our own health and progress through life without us being dependent on authorities to tell us what's what or to give us this, that, and the other.
So it goes back to the idea of our human potential, right?
It's all enmeshed, that's right. That's why these narratives are suppressed. If these ancient narratives were just saying paleo-contact, in the past our ancestors were taught agriculture by ETs, I think you could let that story lie. But because it's all enmeshed with stories of you and me achieving greater power, greater independence, higher cognitive abilities, I think that's why the indigenous narratives have been suppressed, because governments want governable populations. That is why, for instance, in the United States of America, indigenous traditions of initiation were illegalized for 100 years. That's why in the USA, Canada, and Australia, from 1880 to 1980, there were stolen generation policies, kidnapping children, taking them away from indigenous parents so there could be no transmission of these powers. the conquering forces in each of those countries wanted full spectrum dominance, wanted a population that's easily governed, didn't want other sources of power and or information.
Is it true that NASA is possibly funding theologians to relay a message about contact?
Well, the short answer is yes, it is true. NASA and Snopes have been anxious to say, no, they don't employ theologians. But the fact is, what NASA's quite happy to say it has done, is they have funded theologians to help them think through issues of how to communicate information about ET contact. It is one of these cases of subcontracting it out. They sourced 24 theologians to work together and to address these questions of what are the theological implications of contact and how would we best communicate it. And it's interesting that NASA did that, and the Vatican did it, and the Royal Society did it. Again, I think it's a little hint that we're being
prepared for disclosure. It seems like it, and it's exciting. We're definitely living in the most exciting times, I think. Like I've seen, even if the congressional hearings didn't give out much, I think we're going to get to a point where these things become more commonplace. I think it's like a slow drip to control the public's perspective on it, maybe so people don't kind of lose their mind, but it's definitely a slow drip.
I think it has to be a slow drip, as you say, to habituate people to the idea. I think what our governments want to avoid is that very percussive moment where the President of the United States of America steps forward and says, my fellow Americans, I got something I want to tell you. And all of a sudden we're told we've been in contact for 70 years and we've lied about it. And we may even have killed a few people along the way to keep a lid on this because we didn't think you could cope. I'm so sorry for the people who've frozen to death in the winter and those who've lost their homes because they can't pay their utility bills, because we have had access to free energy all this time. I think they're avoiding a percussive moment like that because of the political fallout. I don't think that people would lose their minds because they think we're in contact. A huge proportion of Americans have worked out we're probably in contact. People around the world have worked out we're probably in company. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is trust in government. If they come forward and say there's been a cover-up on this scale, and then how do they deal with the follow-up questions? So who's in charge? If there's an intergalactic federation, as Hayam Ashed says, who's representing us on that body? Are these elected officials? In whose interest are decisions being made? We've been electing you guys to run our country. You saying somebody else has been running our country? I mean, can you imagine the political complexity of all the obvious questions that come from a moment like that? Far simpler to drip, 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 drip. We're in contact. We've been in contact. We're in a managed situation. We're in a stable situation. Yes, we know about this technology. Yes, we know where that came from, so on and so forth, bit by bit. And I would say that that approach is working because when the Pentagon verified the UFO phenomenon, went by without a blip. So that if I say to people, do you realize the Pentagon has now authenticated the UFO phenomenon? They said it's real. And they said that there's zero evidence that these UFO craft are terrestrial craft by terrestrial intelligence. They've come from somewhere else. The reaction of non-shock is extraordinary. Not even an, I don't believe that. Oh, yes, I think I'd heard that. So if that's the reaction, then I think the drip, drip, drip is working. There's no blind panic there, is there?
No. Definitely not. I think I see why now, but I don't know how they're ever going to get, like you said, around the idea that we have the anti-gravity and free energy, because I think we have had it, and that's going to be a tough one for them to come out to the public with. I can't figure out for the life of me how they'll do it.
This is very topical. Right now, we're having an energy crisis in Australia. Australians can't afford their electricity bills. Gas is not available to Australians, despite the fact that there's a huge gas surplus, because there's a gas market. And it's more important for private companies to make enormous profits than for Australians to be able to heat and light their homes. There's an enormous oil market. that has dominated foreign policy, warfare, the domestic life of Americans in the USA for decades and decades and decades. So much of our international politics is built on the politics of oil. What on earth would happen to these vested interests who pay for government policy all around the world if all of a sudden oil and gas are not necessary because we've got free power?
Yeah.
It is profoundly disrupting to acknowledge there's a simpler way of getting power, as Tesla said all those years ago. And it's one of the reasons why, at a human level, we're still in a policy of non-disclosure.
Yeah, I agree. The last question I wanted to ask you was, you got to work with Mauro Biglino. I really respect what he has to say on paleocontact as well.
Yes, I really respect Mauro as well, which is why I'm very happy doing this series with him, which is going out on the Mauro Biglino channel and on The Fifth Kind. I find it really funny that Eric von Daniken, Mauro Biglino, myself, we've all come to it via theology. And that's what we're talking about in the series, issues of Bible translation that have opened up the world of paleocontact to us. Now, when I wrote Escaping from Eden, I was looking at some key words in the ancient Hebrew texts that point to paleocontact. And I was following my nose, following my own logic, following the data, reaching these conclusions. I was finishing the book when I discovered, oh, I'm not the first person to have followed this white rabbit. I discovered Zechariah Sitchin, and I discovered Mauro Biglino. And I took great courage from Mauro Biglino's experience because his expertise in Bible translation is not to be sniffed at. He was producing the translations for Vatican-approved interlinear Bibles, where he has to give a precise etymological rendering of each word in the Hebrew text. And then you produce the translations alongside. But when you do it that closely, you realize there are many texts that are not about God, but that have traditionally been translated that way. He followed that data at great cost to himself because it meant that he could no longer work for the Paulist press producing interlinear Bibles because he was asking inconvenient questions. There's technology in this text. Why don't we translate it that way? There are advanced beings from off-planet here. Why don't we translate it that way? There's a wormhole here. Why don't we translate it that way? And so as I discovered the work of Mauro, I was very encouraged, I wasn't the first person to think this, that someone with his credentials in Bible translation was reaching the same conclusions as myself. And so when we finally met, it was a great pleasure, and I'm now really enjoying this work together, which I hope will really shine a light for a new generation on the information that's in the Bible that means you really can't go home believing the old God stories that we told from out of the Bible and miss out this whole layer of ancient ET contact curated so carefully by the ancient writers of the Hebrew texts.
I agree. I heard you're writing a fourth book.
It will follow on from the Eden trilogy, and it will dig a little bit deeper, and it will look at the question of what was the Bible about then? Once we realize there's paleo-contact in it, okay, it changes it a bit. So what did our ancestors want us to know? And that's where I'm going.
That should be amazing. Thank you so much, Paul. I really enjoyed this. I'll talk to you soon. Have a good night.